Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. I was working at Pandemic Studios. I just noticed it is incredibly echoey in here, and I'm wondering, has it always been like that? I just noticed right now I've got some soundproofing stuff out in my garage. Some of that acoustic foam stuff. I should just put some of that stuff up here and put some carpet down, absorb some sound. I know we're going to start shooting videos in the new office, but I think I'm always going to want to keep this set up the way it is, because that way, anytime I want to, I can always just record a video and not have to drive into work. So definitely, I think we need to do some soundproofing in here. It kind of blows my mind that I'm only thinking about that now. Anyway, I was working at Pandemic Studios on the first video game I ever worked on, Mercenaries, which was a ton of fun. Mercenaries, Playground of Destruction. And I had been a designer in the tabletop business, and this is the first game I ever worked on, and I really felt like that first Mercenaries game, that team, I felt like we could have done anything. We could have made any video game, and I felt the same way about the Evolve team, that these were two teams that could beat the world. And I guess I'm just incredibly lucky, or maybe all AAA, maybe everybody working at AAA games feels that way. Anyway, I was in charge of 6 missions, or 52 missions, so it wasn't that many. I was in charge of 6 missions, and they were the second half of the South Korean plot line. A lot of fun. We did a lot of research in that game. I learned a lot about North Korea. I mean, we did way more research for both Mercenaries 1 and Mercenaries 2 than you would ever need to do to make those games. They're basically G.I. Joe games. But the whole design team ended up with their heads full of what's going on in North Korea. And that was super educational and super fun. And then we did it again for Venezuela. I was in charge of, I think it was one of the last missions. It might have been SK-12. I'm not sure. And I ran into a problem. This was a team, I thought, full of very smart people, and we would often have big, huge knockdown, drag-out arguments, but it would get often very heated, but no one ever felt like they were challenging the person. It always felt like we were challenging the ideas, and that was, I thought, a very fertile environment. But the side effect of that was, if you ever went to the lead designer, or, God forbid, the design director with an issue, with a problem, it meant that this was largely an intractable problem, that if you could have solved it on your own, or with you and another designer just talking about it, you would have already done that. So when I encountered a problem and went to the design director, it was because I already thought about it a lot, and I thought I had what was essentially the only solution, and I believed very strongly in it. The issue was that this mission, whichever one it was, you took the mission down here where the South Korean headquarters was, but the actual mission itself took place way over here on the other side of the map, literally as far away as 2 points could be on this map, and that wasn't true of any other mission in the game. That's an important point. Every other mission in the game, it was easier to get from where you took the mission to where the mission was than this one. And everyone involved in the process knew that there was no way to move any of these things. That would be too much work, and it would destabilize the entire structure of all the missions. The mission had to start here and it had to end here, with the side effect that it took a long time to get from the headquarters, the South Korean headquarters, to where the dude was that you had to kill. And even if I gave the player a helicopter, it still took literally 7 or 8 minutes of doing nothing but flying in a straight line to get from where you started to where you were going. And I thought that was a pain in the butt. It was unfun. And I went to the design director and I told him that. And his response somewhat typically was, well, it's your challenge as a designer to go make that interesting, go find some way to make that fun or engaging. And obviously, if I could have done that, I wouldn't have been going to talk to him in the first place, and I told him so. And I said, listen, there's only really 2 ways to do this, because we don't have, what does making it interesting mean in a game that's like GTA, but in a war zone? We don't have a radio in the helicopter for you to listen to and change channels and listen to different music. We can't put on, fireworks show or something like that. There's nothing to distract the player except combat. It is literally the only shot in our locker. And there's only 2 ways this can work. Either there is combat on the way there, but it is trivial and it's not going to be really that challenging, in which case the player is just going to find it incredibly tedious and a waste of time, and it's going to make that travel time take even longer. Or there's combat and it is challenging and it is something that could really, kill the player, in which case they're going to have to start all over again and maybe have to do that 7-minute helicopter flight several times before they even get to the mission. I felt like this was purely a logical argument, that there was no design necessary, no testing necessary, just sit and think about it. Either we challenge the player on the way there, in which case they could fail the challenge and have to start over again, which makes it even more tedious since that's not the mission. This is just the thing they're doing on the way to the mission. Or the combat encounter isn't a challenge, in which case largely it's just going to feel like a waste of time. And after we argued about it for quite a while, it may have taken a couple of days, but that's not unusual, by the way. It's not unusual when you challenge the design of something for the person whose design it was to go, and not like it and then go away. And then after they've thought about it for a little while, come back and say, as happened, you're right, that you know what, let's just start the player outside the mission. My suggestion was, instead of once you accept the mission, starting outside the South Korean headquarters, which was, by the way, a perfectly arbitrary thing. We could have loaded you anywhere in the world. Let's load the player outside the base that they're going to be storming. Let's begin outside the dungeon. And the objections to that were very, I felt like, producery objections. Producers tend to like things to be ordered and regular, and they don't like exceptions. But I think exceptions are part and parcel of being a designer. And the attitude was, if we let you, Matt, start the player outside the mission, then that will be the only mission out of 52 missions. That'll be the only one that's true of. And that's bad for some reason, that it violates some principle. There's no code in the game that forbids this. There's no moral imperative that forbids it. There are no laws of physics but it's some principle that we would be violating and that would make the game somehow messy. But I didn't believe in any of that nonsense. I thought, why can't we make an exception for this one unique situation? And after the design director had thought about it for a little while, he agreed, and that's what we did. Hopefully by now you have guessed at the subject of the video, which is making travel interesting. And if you were paying attention to that story I just told, you probably have some idea how I feel about it. But the issue is that we are dungeon masters and we want to present the world as a real place that is fraught with danger, or even not even just danger, but some sense of reality, and that weird and strange and sometimes interesting things can happen when we travel from point A to point B. And indeed, if you played the game back in 1974 or whatever, the game was basically the town and the dungeon, and they had a whole other game that they bought from Avalon Hill that they told you had to go buy if you wanted to play D&D, called Wilderness Survival or something like that, where just getting across this hex map was the game. Because back then, that was the game. There wasn't anything else. There wasn't this idea of worlds or narratives or stories or plots or anything like that. It was just start in the town, get to the dungeon, survive the trip to the dungeon, and then load up with treasure, survive the dungeon, load up with treasure, and somehow try to find a way back. But I don't think we play that way anymore. I don't think in general, although I think that would still be fun, I think in general we no longer expect looting the dungeon and getting back with your treasure to be the challenge, right? We no longer award 10,000 gold pieces, but it's all in copper, just because we want to challenge the player's ability to get their treasure back home. So we've already advanced, I think, somewhat as players out of that travel is the point of the game era. And I'm here to give you permission to just fast forward things. I think the notion of trying to make travel interesting is largely a red herring. It's this thing that distracts us from what we're actually trying to do. It's okay unless the point of your adventure, and in fact, many games that I have run, first through third level, just getting around is the point. And the players emerge from third level thinking, wow, the world really is a dangerous place. But now we're a little bit more confident. We have a little bit more power, a little bit more literal experience and metaphorical experience. And getting from point A to point B is no longer that big a deal. It's our responsibility as dungeon masters to advance the plot. So unless you think that traveling through the wilderness is going to advance the plot, I am giving you permission to just skip it, to narrate it in such a way that makes it sound real, to make it sound like, it rained, you were wet, it was somewhat miserable, you had to hunt for food, you arrive at wherever it was you're going, the city you were traveling to, the dungeon you're getting ready to explore. I've been doing this for a while, and that gives me a lot of experience, but that's not necessarily the same as authority. I have never regretted fast forwarding past the just getting from point A to point B part. I have often regretted trying to make it interesting. I often think that the player should have choices regarding how they get from point A to point B, and no matter how much work I did, it turned out not to be that rewarding, and that I probably could have just said, screw it, you get there. So I've often had it fail when I try to make it real. Sometimes it works, but I've often had it fail when I try to make it interesting. I've never had it fail when I say, you get there. But because this is not the don't do that channel. This is the do what you want channel. My advice for, and this isn't just my advice, we're actually going to do this. I think maybe even in the first episode of the upcoming new D&D stream, spoilers, if you want to make travel interesting, if you want to give travel tension, which I think is our responsibility as dungeon masters, I think a great way to do that is a skill challenge from 4th edition, which I have extolled the virtues of before. And to great effect, I've seen a lot of people online using skill challenges. And I think generally when people, the reaction is either that's cool, I'm going to do it, or that sounds cool, but I don't really understand it. So let's actually talk about how I would deploy a skill challenge to get from point A to point B. Skill challenges were something introduced to Dungeons & Dragons in 4th edition, but it predates 4th edition by like at least a decade. They used to call them extended tests back in the 90s and other RPGs. But the idea is that all the players are collectively going to work together on a problem. And I think it's a really good mechanic for us cooperating on something. We already have plenty of rules for how to deal with doing things individually. Skill challenges help the dungeon master encourage players to work together on something. It's a very flexible framework. There's not one right way to run skill challenges. And actually, I think its flexibility is one of the things that's daunting to dungeon masters that are not familiar with it because they feel like, exactly what am I supposed to do? But the idea is that the players tell you what skills they're going to use and this is an important part, how they're going to use them. They have to narrate or justify their use of the skill. And then you set a difficulty class, a DC, which maybe you tell them, maybe you don't. And they have to accumulate a certain number of successes. And this is, how difficult is this? I think 3 is the minimum. Very easy skill challenge. They have to get 3 successes. I think a very hard skill challenge might be 6 before they accumulate 3 failures. Now, what happens when they accumulate 3 failures? What happens when they get 4 successes is up to you. So for this challenge, what I would say is, because it's just travel from point A to point B, it is not the point of the adventure. I would tell the players that that they're going to get there. That's not the issue. There are other skill challenges where you might fail the skill challenge entirely, but you're going to get there. And we stop testing once you get 4 successes. And if you can get to 4 successes and not accumulate any failures, there is no combat. But there will be a combat when you, somewhere on the way from point A to point B, maybe when you arrive at the dungeon, and how difficult it is will be determined by how many failures you accumulated. So that means there's basically, I've got to have 3 encounters ready. I have to have an encounter ready for if they got 1 failure before they got 4 successes, 2 or 3 failures, the maximum before they got 4 successes, and I cap it at 3. I think all skill challenges cap at 3. Then I will tell the players, all right, you're trying to get from point A to point B, you're trying to navigate your way through the wilderness, so you know that you can use nature and survival to get there, but you can try any skill if you can justify its use to me. And I am not afraid, by the way, of telling the players no, because often the players, obviously, they want to contribute. And if you use skill challenges enough, all the players will eventually get to contribute. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect every possible type of character to be equally useful in every possible type of skill challenge. And as a result, if the players can't think of a reasonable use of their skills, I have no problem telling them, no, that's not going to work, that's silly. So I tell the players, A, you can't use the same skill more than once. That if you try to use survival to get there, that represents your best attempt at it. And it represents an attempt at it over several days. Here is the result. How well did you do? Because otherwise, the characters with high survival will just make all the checks for the party, and then it's not a cooperative thing. I'll also tell the players that they can't make an attempt unless they are proficient in the skill, because again, we're trying to restrict. Otherwise, if we don't put these restrictions on it, if we let all players try all skills, then you just end up with everyone at the table rolling dice. That's like a scrum until eventually the dungeon master gives up and says, fine, you get there. So and this is, I think, a reasonable restriction. I think I got it from my friend Jordy, who said, I think you have to be proficient in the skill to give it a shot. One of the things I love about skill challenges, and this has happened every time I've ever deployed them, is the players start to get really creative with the use of their skills, and they interact with their skills in a way they never did before. And often I discover that there are some players who aren't really that excited or turned on by combat or some of the other parts of the game. They really like using their skills in skill challenges. I might not have been able to think of a reasonable use for arcana in the process of navigating through a wilderness, but if the wizard player came up with a good enough rationale for why arcana might be reasonable, I might give it a shot. For instance, if they say, well, have I read in the research, in my wizardly research, has there ever been an arcane tome that mentioned anything about some ancient roads that went through here that I might know about? That, to me, would impress me, and I would go, actually, that's not a bad idea. Of course, if I were being deliberate moderately, stringent with this stuff, I would say, no, that would be history. And I can imagine myself, depending on how the adventure was going, how the party was going, I can imagine saying, no, that would be history, but that's a good idea. Or I could imagine saying, yeah, go for it. If the players are desperate, for instance, and it's obvious that they're going to hit 3 failures, I might let the wizard try Arcana based on that justification. But again, I have no problem telling players no if they can't come up with a good reason. I really like it when the fighter player says, well, I don't know. I'm not trained in these things, but I'm trained in athletics, which is not often a useful skill, by the way. And I noticed that athletics actually ends up being very useful in a lot of the skill challenges I run. If the fighter player said, is there maybe there's a river and that we wouldn't otherwise be able to ford, except I can pick up this huge log and I can carry it and create a bridge across the river, I would give that the thumbs up. What the DC is should be dependent on the skill. I think some skills are more applicable than others. And in general, you want to encourage the players to try things. And so if you set the DCs too high, that will discourage them. So I would say normally DCs in the 13 range, or 13 to 15 or 12 to 14 would be reasonable. But it doesn't follow that it should be the same DC for every skill. It's reasonable to conclude that some skills are more useful in getting through the wilderness, and so therefore it might be a lower challenge rating, a lower CR, to use a lower, what do they call it? Difficulty class. I almost said target number at one point. I've got a million different terms for these things running around inside my head. So you can use different DCs for different skills depending on how hard you think it is or should be, or even how well the players are doing. If they're doing poorly and you're afraid that they're going to get smoked when you run this encounter because they've already accumulated 2 failures and no successes, maybe dial down on the difficulty class. I'm also pretty open about difficulty classes usually. I don't always tell the players what the DC is for a skill, but I sometimes do. It doesn't automatically have to be a combat that they deal with. For instance, on the way through the wilderness, maybe they encounter a bunch of elves who question them about what they're doing in our forest. And the players are like, your forest? And now there's a negotiation that if they had managed to get 4 successes and 0 failures, they would have bypassed entirely. And the players often, they like knowing that. They like knowing that we are sitting here in this diplomatic encounter right now because we accumulated too many failures and not enough successes. It makes it feel like their actions matter. And in this case, they do. The encounter, be it a role-playing encounter, maybe it's a puzzle, right? Remember that when I think they probably only accumulated 1 failure on the way to Moria, and so the dungeon master, John, took it easy on them and said, okay, there's a puzzle, but then they really screwed up on that puzzle and took forever, and he just got exasperated and threw a Cthulhu monster at them. But it doesn't have to be a combat encounter. It can be a diplomatic encounter, a negotiation. It can be a puzzle when they get to where it is they're going. And it doesn't have to be at the end. You can say it's in the middle. It's up to you to determine where it is, but there should be one framework, the skill challenge, for getting from point A to point B. And you can use this same thing to cross the wilderness, to get through the Underdark, to get from the inn to the docks and get to a boat to get out of town. You can use this lots of different ways just to get from one part of the city to another. Anyway, you can tell I'm a fan of skill challenges. That's how I would make overland travel, or just travel in general, interesting. That's the video, folks. I hope you found some parts of it useful. For me, a successful video is one that prompts thought, even if it doesn't necessarily result in people using my ideas. That doesn't bother me at all. What I hope is that these videos make you think, that's interesting, but I would do it this way. Speaking of doing it this way, we did a live stream the other night where I started working on what I call the party sheet. This is an idea I stole from Warhammer 4th edition, and it was a pretty successful stream, and we got about halfway through it, and we'll probably continue doing it later this week. I'm not sure when. We streamed on Friday night. I think that went pretty well. And I'm going to upload that video to YouTube right after this. So hopefully when this video goes up, just however long it takes to upload the next video, so maybe like half an hour or an hour, I don't know, it's a big video, it'll immediately go up on YouTube. The goal of the stream was to design the party sheet for the upcoming campaign. In other words, the players already know, they've already decided they're going to play a mercenary company called The Chain. It's going to be the chain of something. I just don't know what yet. And I want to give them a couple of options as to what kind of mercenary company are they. and then make there be cooperative benefits for either of these. And we did that. We succeeded in doing that. Succeeded. Haven't tried it out yet. Haven't deployed it, but that's what playtesting's for. And then I started working the problem of what people online have started calling it the get to 6 design, the get to 6 encounters. The idea that Dungeons and Dragons was, at least the advice they give in the Dungeon Master's Guide, is that the average party will typically get through 6 combat encounters. This is the language in the DMG, a day. And people are like, well, maybe they meant 6 including like puzzles and negotiation. But that's not what it says. And no one does that. No one who plays this game seems... I did a poll on Twitter and like thousands of people responded. And the number of people, I think 60% of people responding said they got through 1 or 2 encounters per adventuring day. And just as an exercise, I want to see what happens. I thought about how would we, if we want to get to 6 encounters, if that's the goal, if we think it's unreasonable, and a lot of players do, including me, if we think the 5-minute adventuring day, where we get into 1 combat and now everyone wants to rest because they're trying to minimize risk, players will naturally want to minimize risk. What's the solution there? How do we try to get them from 1 or 2 encounters per day, because we don't think that's reasonable, to 6 encounters per day so that it feels like they got a lot done? And I was actually on, it was the second, I think, DM roundtable with Adam Colville, Matt Mercer, me for some reason, and Mike Merles, and I think it was Mike Merles, no surprise, who said, you could just come up with a system where powers, like player abilities just powered up after certain encounters. And that's exactly what we're doing. And that went really well. We only got through the Paladin. I invented a party with 5 random classes in it. And we started on the Paladin. And we actually, I think, did pretty well. We came up with, here's a bunch of Paladin abilities that you get depending on what encounter you're in. And we don't have to incentivize every encounter. The players are already incentivized to get into 1 or 2 every day, but all by themselves. And just from that, what I discovered was when I went online, people on the subreddit, which there's a link to in the doobly-doo, people in the subreddit were already coming up with their own ideas of how to get to 6 with different classes. And the premise of the stream is that we can do this as Dungeon Masters just for our party. We don't have to solve this problem for every class. That would take quite a long time. We can just solve this problem of giving our characters, these specific characters, not just a paladin, an Oath of Vengeance, this player's Oath of Vengeance paladin, specific buffs at certain encounters to encourage them to get to 6th level. And if this continues, we're going to end up with a whole library, especially if I curate it and pick the ones that I think are good and tweak them to make them in accord with my experience as a designer and a player and a dungeon master. Then we're going to end up with a huge library, and that will ultimately be useful to everybody, saying, here's how we get to 6 encounters. Regardless of what class and specialty you are, you're going to get certain buffs that are unique to your class and specialty. It was a lot of fun, so stay tuned for that. What is it? Is it Monday? Let's say we're going to continue tomorrow night. We're going to finish the stream tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Pacific time. I have no idea when that is your time. Please don't complain to me about the time that we stream. Please don't bother asking me what time that is in your time zone. One of us is going to have to Google it. Might as well be you. Speaking of the idea that travel shouldn't be so easy, it should be interesting, it should be challenging, you should have to earn it, and the idea that a 5-minute adventuring day it's too short, it's not realistic, it should be longer, you should have to get into more encounters per day. I normally, I don't spend a lot of time online looking up other D&D content creators because I already sort of live and breathe this stuff. And I go to YouTube to just watch literally anything else. But in this one instance, YouTube threw up a recommendation to me and I just laughed out loud at the title of the video. The title of the video is My Terrible Rules for Getting an Animal Encounter. And I watched the video and in fact, they're great rules. Ha! You didn't know I was going to say that, did you? So go check out, this video was a lot of fun. I liked it quite a lot. And it's all about that notion of making things that are currently hand wavy, magic wandy, like you just get it. You just get your animal companion. Making that kind of thing more of a challenge, more of a narrative experience, so that when you get your animal companion, that companion has meaning to you and there's a story to it. And even though as a designer now, I tend to see the point of view of you just get it. You just get there. It's fine. I have certainly played many very successful, very fun, engaging RPGs whose whole point is taking the stuff that's very gamist in Dungeons and Dragons and turning it into more of a simulation, making it feel more realistic. I mean, I liked Harn and Harn World, and that's a game where your character could very easily die of cholera just getting from one place to another. So hi the hence to Monarch's Factory. She has a ton of videos up. I think you'll get a huge kick out of them. And like my friend Jim, she's uploading videos all the time. So if I feel like I don't have to do as much, I can take a break and take a rest, which is good because I've got this whole Strongholds and Followers thing I've got to finish at some point. The playtest packet is going to go out. By the way, the first playtest packet, which is intentionally very tiny, is going to go out, I think, within the next, 12 hours. Stay tuned. Super excited. That's it, folks. Making travel interesting. We will be live tomorrow night, finishing up the party sheet, maybe doing the other 4 characters and giving them special abilities. Until next time, peace out.